The sensation of the ship listing more than usual and Amelia's sudden, dismayed cry abruptly woke Ludmilla from her sleep. Her eyes snapped open and she reached for the spear that she had placed on the deck nearby. Throwing open her covers and jumping to her feet, her gaze darted over her surroundings. She only saw the undead crew who seemed to be carrying on as usual. However, there was no sign of attackers along the shores to either side or in the water flowing around them. "Apologies, my lady." Amelia spoke off to her side somewhere fretfully. "I did not mean to wake you so rudely." Ludmilla turned her head in the direction of her maid's voice. By the looks of it, she was preparing breakfast and the movement of the ship had caused one of the bags to tip over, spilling its contents across the deck. After discerning the reason why Amelia had cried out, Ludmilla loosened her grip on her spear. She bent over and picked up one of the blankets, wrapping it about her shoulders to shield herself from the ever-present northern winds. A thin mist covered the river and the lower slopes of the valley. It was not enough to become an immediate hazard in the broad and deep Katza River, but it gave the cold a lingering dampness that clung to one's skin and clothing. She looked up, scanning her surroundings to orient herself to their current position on the river. She was familiar with its course and did not expect any rough travel conditions until later that day. After she registered the dense forests filling the horizon ahead and the northern extent of the barrier ranges to the southeast, she realized that they had traveled much further than she had expected. Looking up to the perfectly trimmed sail and back to the undead still tirelessly rowing since they had embarked the previous day, she immediately understood why they had traveled so quickly. The villagers crewing the ship on her previous journeys did not constantly row the vessel upstream, instead relying mostly on the wind to carry them forward. The speed of a human crew would also slow at night, partially out of caution, whereas the undead who were reputed to have dark vision could navigate regardless of lighting with no worries. The ship was also not carrying its regular load, which would have been the supplies purchased for the rest of the year. After a wide bend in the river, they would be coming up on the place where the boat had been run aground and the river made its sharpest turns before heading into the gorge south of Warden's Vale. Once they headed south up through the steep and narrow canyon, the winds would drive them quickly to their destination and they would most likely arrive sometime in the evening, a full day ahead of schedule. She walked to the rear of the vessel where the captain kept its hand on the tiller, and warned of the oncoming course of the river. It acknowledged her words and she returned to the hold, where Amelia had just finished cleaning up the mess over the deck and resumed putting together breakfast. "Were you able to sleep well, Amelia?" she asked. "It must be a new experience for you to sail on a ship. Some people have trouble getting used to it." "Yes, my lady, thank you," Amelia replied as she handed over Ludmilla's portion. "I slept well. It's very cold this morning, though. If we hadn't stopped to pick up that extra clothing at Corlin Village, I'm not sure what I'd have done. It gets colder as we travel upriver. It may have snowed in the past few days, considering the rain we've had in Iranthal." "Snow, my lady?" Amelia said. "That's a rare sight in the city. I've probably only seen snow a half-dozen times in my life, and it never stays on the ground like you see in the mountains to the north. Still, I'm very excited to see what sort of place Warden's Vale is." The expression of childlike wonder in her tone made Ludmilla wonder in turn about what sort of grand spectacle her excited maid was anticipating. It compelled her to try to lower the impossibly high bar at which Amelia had seemingly set her expectations. "Warden's Vale is a beautiful place, but it's still a frontier territory," she stepped lightly with her words. "It's nowhere near as developed as the interior regions of the duchy." "I see," Amelia replied, but the energy in her voice was undiminished. "But since you defend the borderlands, there should at least be a castle, yes?" "A castle?" The word stabbed at Ludmilla like a spear. Did the other, wealthier nobles even have castles? House Corlin was absurdly wealthy, and even they did not have a castle or anything resembling one. Certainly, there were walled cities as well as fortifications watching over a few key strategic points in Riestais. The city of Iranthal was an example of both, but the vast gap between reality and Amelia's expectations made Ludmilla feel like she had already betrayed her maid somehow. "There's no castle," Ludmilla said, "but the village itself is built on a series of ramparts for defense." "Then, your manor and estate must be quite large with all the free land?" Ludmilla opened her mouth, then closed it again. She wasn't even sure how a large estate and manor could fit in a village built on stony ramparts. Amelia really did seem to have a whimsical image of the place where she would be arriving, not even understanding this much. My manor is in the village, it's just a bit larger than a villager's home there. The entire settlement is defensive in nature, so there are no vast estates or ornamental gardens. It's just a village that's only a fraction of the size of Corlin village, and even a wealthy barony like that does not have a castle, or vast estates. Lady Corlin does have a comfortable manor, though. But the wilderness is teeming with savage demi-humans, Amelia said in disbelief at her mistress' words. With so few, how did you keep them at bay for so many generations? Through constant vigilance, Ludmilla replied. Every villager was trained to fight, and everyone participated in the patrols, including the members of House Saradnik. I'm not sure what stories you've heard, but it isn't as if all of the demi-humans in the wilderness are in that one small corner bordering our territory. And they do understand the concept of territory. A healthy respect of one's neighbors is something that they appreciate, even if their neighbors are humans. As long as you're not considered an easy target for their predations, and don't agitate them for senseless reasons, they'll look elsewhere for more likely prey. Then you're not always fighting? Amelia asked. Not usually, Ludmilla answered. In times of plenty, the demi-humans don't need to range very far from their own territories to find food. The only instances where we usually see conflict is when there is famine or disaster in their lands, or new tribes migrate into the region and push out the old ones. When that happens, the balance of power is disrupted and so are the territories of the various demi-human populations, so we must ensure that their respect for our territory is enforced. Stronger ones also appear to try and make a name for themselves by accomplishing some feat of strength, but it's not something that happens very frequently. Amelia had become fixated on her words, sitting on the edge of the deck overlooking the hold. How strong can these demi-humans become? Ludmilla seated herself beside her, looking towards the mountains that loomed over the valley. They can be very strong, she told her. Many demi-humans have natural advantages that we don't, so trying to compare them directly to a soldier or an adventurer can be misleading. The last time such a demi-human appeared in the fashion I described above was when I was still a child. The patrol that ran into him and his companions filled them full of arrows, killing most of his group as they charged their position. Even so, he still made it to their lines and killed a third of the patrol before he was finally put down with a combined effort. A demi-human like that would be roughly as strong as an orichalcum rank adventurer. Ludmilla kept a straight face, even as she left out the fact that it was on this very patrol that her own mother had been killed, lest she worry Amelia overly much. As the strongest patrol leader in the village, the demi-human had marked her mother out as a worthy adversary to prove his own prowess as a warrior. It was an unfortunate fact of life on the frontier. The strong would seek the strong, in a never-ending back and forth between all the races that lived there. If her mother had not been present, the entire patrol would have been wiped out in Wardensvale soon after. That was just how precarious their situation had become. Fortunately, her mother's death had brought nearly a decade free from strong challengers, the latest in generations of sacrifice that enforced their status as a rival rather than a raid target. Are frontiersmen really that powerful? Amelia's eyes grew wide. I've heard stories, of course, but you make it seem like even farmers on the border are as strong as adventurers. Ludmilla paused to think of a way to answer her question. The lives of city folk were so far removed from her own that she found herself taking many things for granted, even when she thought she was answering her maid's questions thoroughly. Several years ago, Ludmilla said, the wife of Count Jesn brought an adventurer bard that had earned her patronage to a luncheon for the noble ladies of the territory during the winter markets. One of the tales he sang revolved around a party of brave young adventurers being set upon by a tribe of goblins. Most in attendance were aghast when he described the goblins' dishonorable and underhanded tactics in battle, but I thought they seemed perfectly reasonable. Are you saying that you fight like a goblin, my lady? Amelia looked like she had been dunked headfirst into the river. Perhaps, Ludmilla smiled at the memory of the rather colorful story. I'm not sure just how much that bard embellished his tale. But I can tell you that in a life and death struggle, having a fair fight is the last thing on most people's minds. She reached into a pocket inside her kirtle, pulling out a ceramic jar that fit into the palm of her hand. Unscrewing the cap, she displayed the grey paste inside, which gave off a light, spicy odor. This is a type of poison, she said, and Amelia, who had been inching her face closer to the jar, suddenly pulled back upon hearing her words. The jar contains enough for around 100 arrows. It's potent enough to probably paralyze even an adamantite rank adventurer, unless they have items or magic to counteract it. Demi-human tribes usually do not have such items, so they rely on their own casters in the event that they are poisoned. A single frontier patrol, however, can unleash so many of these arrows in a short span of time that even several such casters have no hope of keeping up. Ludmilla put the jar away and continued speaking. We use poison and traps, misdirection and ambushes. There is no limit to unfair methods. If a demi-human reaches our lines, a half-dozen fighters with spears will work in concert to take it down. If it can be harmed, then we'll devise the most efficient ways to kill it. The entire purpose of a frontier territory is to clearly define where the wilderness ends and where our lands begin. With our limited numbers we must do so in the most cost-effective manner that can be achieved, or we'll inevitably be overrun. Amelia's look of childlike wonder had been mostly wiped away, replaced by something between a worried and resolute face. But, what about all the stories about honor and chivalry? She said tentatively, the old tales of gallantry and heroism that are sung of the nobles and knights that defend the realm? I'd say those are fanciful tales spun to entertain the masses, Ludmilla replied plainly. A noble does not prioritize a warrior's honor, and it has no place when measured against duty. A noble's duty is defined by the contracts between liege and vassal. Duty as a noble's honor, fealty and obligation determine what is chivalrous. No amount of personal pride as a warrior will excuse negligence and failure in one's duties. You must keep this in mind at all times as well, Amelia. You are part of House Saradnik now. As a member of a noble retinue, you must understand the difference between fantasy and reality. Yes, my lady. Amelia lowered her head. I will not fail you. Amelia offered no more questions after that, returning to her work. The change from her former expression had Ludmilla worrying about whether she had squashed her expectations a bit too ruthlessly. She was always chided by her family for getting too wrapped up in what she was saying and being too blunt with her words. It seemed like she might never grow out of it. Over the next hour, the captain successfully made the turns in the river without incident and the undead crew had navigated through the most hazardous section along the middle reaches of the Katsa River. With their course now heading south, the sails fully caught the north wind and their journey picked up speed. Before noon, they were entering the long gorge that would end at Warden's Vale. Amelia gaped as they passed between the towering granite walls, nearly bare of vegetation. There were no paths or even shores. The cliffs, which kept rising higher to either side as they sailed deeper into the foothills, dropped straight into the river, giving no perches for travelers on land. Small streams would tumble down from the heights every few kilometers, creating breathtaking waterfalls which churned the waters below them. Amelia had renewed some of her previous excitement with the unfamiliar scenery, but Ludmilla saw the familiar passage as an opportunity to relax. The gorge was actually the safest stretch of the river, so deep that it was mostly unassailable by threats from land. By late afternoon, they had entered the borders of the barony. The clouds that had rolled down from Erantal had long since passed, leaving trailing wisps in the cerulean skies. To the south, the peaks of the border ranges beyond the valley could be seen through the crisp air, still crowned in white. Sunlight glistened off of the melt running down the cliffs of the eastern shore and the river swelled from the advent of spring. Ludmilla spotted patches of snow in the shadows of the high valleys that spilled into the river, so it seemed like her thoughts from the past few days about the weather were correct. Beside her, Amelia pulled a handkerchief out of her pocket and wiped away her tears. Ludmilla felt a twinge of guilt. She had taken her maid, who had been raised in the thriving city of Erantal, to the furthest borders of the realm. There were no bustling markets or magical conveniences and land was raw and undeveloped. There weren't even people here anymore, aside from themselves. She raised a hand and placed her arm over her maid's shoulder. "Please don't cry, Amelia," she said in a comforting tone. "Things will surely get better in time." Her maid stiffened at her words. She sniffed, wiped her eyes, then sniffed again. Then she let out a shuddering laugh. "I don't doubt that they will, my lady," she smiled. "That is not the reason for my tears, however. You said your home was beautiful, but that was just a tiny bit of an understatement." Ludmilla had always appreciated the natural beauty of her own home, but the sight did not affect her the same way as it did Amelia. Born and raised in the barony, she was used to the vistas that it offered. The reason why Andrzej Zarodnik had staked his claim here was said to be the natural wonder that it had evoked in him, so she supposed that any outsider might share those same feelings. Ludmila's gaze scanned the familiar surroundings. Rather than marveling over the scenery, she was searching for signs of damage or intrusion. The adventurer, Nobby, had mentioned a few days ago that she had been sent to deal with some trouble in the region, so there had been a lingering worry in her mind all throughout her time in Nirantal about the state of her domain. In the remaining hours that it took for them to come within sight of the village harbour, she had not seen any evidence pointing to the passage of anyone, never mind intruders. The geese still occupied the flooded marshes. There were no tracks on the narrow sandbar, and the village, at least from a distance, seemed unchanged. She turned her attention to the ship's progress as it approached within a few hundred meters of the pier, watching the undead crew and occasionally issuing additional instructions when the captain seemed uncertain about what to do next. After they safely guided the vessel into the harbor and secured it to the pier, Ludmila lifted herself out of the ship and examined the hill. It felt strange how unchanged her home appeared. Though her time away had been less than a week, it certainly seemed like it had been much longer, so she was expecting at least something to have changed, if only a little bit of growth on the grass and various plants that covered the rocky knoll in small patches. Behind her, she saw that Amelia had slipped into her pair of new boots, hitching up the long skirts of her uniform to avoid getting them stained by the muddy path leading up through the village. Behind the maid, several of the skeletons were lined up, carrying their luggage. Ludmila did not recall instructing them to do so. "Did you instruct the skeletons to carry our luggage?" she asked Amelia. I suppose I did." Her maid seemed surprised at herself as well. "Before I climbed out of the ship, I just asked them to without thinking about who I was asking. I don't think I could have if I did." "The undead are a part of our lives now," Ludmila tried to encourage her lady's maid, "so learning how to get along with them is a good thing. You're a senior member of my household staff, so it will serve as an example to everyone else." Amelia's expression wavered between being pleased at her mistress' affirmation of her position and being uncertain about her new relationship with the undead. Ludmila led her odd entourage up the path towards the village entrance, through the winding route between the homes, and stopped in front of the entrance of the baronial manor. It felt absolutely tiny in comparison to the guest manor in Nirantal. This was a feeling that she always seemed to have after returning from the city. As much as she loved her home, it always felt like the simple and rugged village was far inferior to the city, with its well-developed infrastructure and buildings that weren't essentially small holes dug into the hillside. She did not want to know what sort of expression her maid had on her face as she opened the manor door. The familiar smells of home wafted out to greet her even as she stepped across the threshold. The familiar smells of home wafting out to greet her also reminded her that she had left half a pot of stew in the fireplace at the beginning of the week. Quickly pulling off her boots, she rushed over to look into the cookpot. To her relief, the recent weather had left its contents nearly frozen. Glancing to the hall, she saw Amelia off to the side, organizing the contents of their luggage with the skeleton crewman. Ludmila snatched a brush off of the fireplace mantel, grabbed the iron pot and made a break for the door. "Where are you going, my lady?" Amelia's voice stopped her before she could even walk over to where she had left her boots. Ludmila still could not comprehend how her maid was so perceptive when it came to things like this. "Just taking care of this so I can get dinner started," she replied, not quite looking at her attendant. "Oh, you should really leave these things for your servants to take care of," Amelia said with a smile. "There are many other responsibilities that you must attend to, my lady." Ludmila surrendered the pot and the brush, trying her best not to look like a child that had been caught in some sort of mischief. She spotted Jeeves' box along the wall, so she picked it up and carried it outside with her. As she made her way back down to the warehouse, Nonna's flying form crossed her line of sight. The elder lich had flown off before they arrived without any sort of explanation and now settled to the ground nearby as she reached the warehouse door. "Where did you fly off to, Nonna?" Ludmila spoke in a conversational tone while opening the lock holding the crossbar in place. She lifted the wooden beam and placed it to the side, opening the door which creaked slightly on its hinges. "Orientation." Its voice was as expressionless as ever, but Ludmila thought that this particular undead expressed an inquisitive nature with all of its independent movement and observation. Or it could have received instructions along those lines as a part of its assignment. With it coming and going as it pleased, she was never quite sure which it was. The more fanciful part of herself thought that if it was simply following its assignment as an attaché, it would have just followed her around everywhere without any deviation, so she liked to think that her initial reasoning had some basis to it. "Did you see anything out of sorts?" she asked. As the words left her mouth, Ludmilla realized the elder lich wouldn't know what out of sorts was, being here for the first time. "Did you see anyone other than our group while you were looking around?" She elaborated on her first question. "No." Nonna stared back at her after the short reply. With little else to say, Ludmilla turned back to the task at hand. Placing the glossy black box beside the small arrangement of leftover supplies in the corner near the entrance, she opened the lid and Jeeves rose out of it in much the same way he did when she had opened the seal to his container. "Good day, madam," he said in a cheery voice. "How may I be, oh, Lady Zaradnik?" Jeeves stepped out of his box and turned to look around. "Is this the work you spoke of?" he asked as his gaze continued to wander about the mostly empty warehouse. "Is this my inventory?" "It's the village warehouse, and you'll be acting as its manager," Ludmilla said. "There's also the warehouse in the hamlet out in the fields that will be a part of your responsibilities. Our inventories will fill and empty as seasons pass and shipments are sent in and out, but, in the meanwhile, you'll need to familiarize yourself with everything, as well as learn how to read and write." Ludmilla turned to her attaché, who was silently observing them. While Jeeves is free from his duties, Ludmilla asked, "Can you teach him, Nonna? He needs to be able to keep records for accounting and trade, as well as understand any materials provided by the civil office by the time we start sending goods to the capital." "It will be done." Once again, the elder lich gave an immediate affirmative to a task it was able to accomplish. Ludmilla had grown up knowing the undead as unfeeling, single-minded beings, but Nonna's distinctly different responses which depended on whether it was capable of performing a task or not spoke to her of a stubborn sense of pride. The laborers should still take about half a day to arrive. She had distributed the equipment purchased from Mesmet's forge that same evening and sent them out immediately, so it's going to be a busy day tomorrow. I'll be retiring to the manor to rest and prepare. Come and inform me should any problems arise. With that, Ludmilla left the two undead in the warehouse, walking through the village to inspect all the homes which had been shut away. With none of them occupied, the routine half felt like a needless exercise, but she did it anyways to organize her thoughts as she went around. The first thing she would need to get started on the next day was preparing the fields for planting. Though she was developing an appreciation for the tireless constitution of the undead, her experience so far also left her dubious about whether they would know how to do the jobs that were tasked to them and whether she herself knew enough about each task if they did not. The sight of Amelia with the skeletal crewman coming up the hill pulled her from her thoughts. She was carrying the cooking pot and brush, while the skeletons following her were each carrying 2 full buckets of water. The maid had quickly become used to them. It seemed that she had enlisted the crew members to help out with her chores. Ludmilla entered the manor ahead of them and headed to the living space at the end of the hall. The fireplace was already lit, as were the 2 lamps which hung from the ceiling. Their luggage was sorted with clothing and equipment neatly arranged, and the day's worth of leftover food that had been packed away for the journey upriver was being prepared on the counter nearby. Ludmilla changed into the nightwear laid out on the largest bed for her as the sound of the skeletons filling the barrels of water in the hall filled the house. Looking around for the administrative materials that she brought along from Rantel, she saw that they had been placed on the desk at the front of the hall. Her lady's maid seemed a bit too attentive, leaving nothing for Ludmilla to distract herself with, at least nothing that Amelia considered beneath her mistress' noble standing. She seated herself at the desk and started leafing through the pile of materials, but she had gone over them so many times on the trip back that she had nearly memorized their contents. She propped her chin in her hand as she looked out the window, and the fingers of her free hand idly drummed on the wooden surface of the desk. As busy as it had been for the past week, she was now becoming restless with little to do. She turned her head away from the window to look towards the interior of the house where Amelia had almost finished preparing the evening meal. Seeing this, Ludmilla rose from her desk and brought the stack of books and folios to the cabinet where the rest of the barony's documents were stored. After locking everything away, she stepped over to seat herself at the dining table. The skeletons appeared at the door again, entering to fill the last of the 4 barrels that stored water in the manor. With their task complete, they stood by in the hall, awaiting new instructions. "You seem to have been able to put these fellows to work effectively," Ludmilla said idly in an attempt to stave off her boredom. I didn't see anything related from the civil office, but I can check to see if they can be hired out for something like this if you'd like them on a more permanent basis. I don't know how it came to this, I really don't. Amelia placed the last dish on the dining table and stood by as she looked at her impromptu helpers. Maybe a bit of you has rubbed off on me, my lady. You seem to direct everything so effortlessly. I wasn't even thinking when I directed the skeletons from the ship. Well, not everything I say goes accordingly, Ludmilla responded dryly. Besides, back at Corlin Village, Nonna said that they would understand what we intend, as long as the instructions are straightforward. As I recall, Lady Shiltier said much the same yesterday. Nonna, my lady? I gave the Elder Lich a name yesterday evening. It didn't seem to mind. Having all these nameless undead running around everywhere is going to become confusing, so at least the ones we work closely with could do with a name. I see. Amelia mouthed the name a few times. Anyways, I can see how the skeletons will be a great help, especially when it's just myself here, but they must come with a price of some sort? How much does it cost to rent the undead? Well, the cost for the undead this season has been waived since we're basically field testing them and acting as a sort of pilot for their adoption into the duchy's industries. Normally, it's 1/10 of the production that they partake in. The regular rates have been structured in such a way that it's actually more cost-effective than the traditional shares that human tenants keep from their work. At least in a direct comparison. Isn't that bad? Amelia frowned. If the nobles replaced all of their tenants with the undead, how will the people survive without their livelihoods? That's a question I'm still trying to answer. Ludmilla looked at her meal and then looked back up to Amelia. You should sit down and have dinner as well. There is no servants' hall in this manor, and it's just us here anyways. Thank you, my lady. Amelia sat down across from her after retrieving her meal. As I was saying, Ludmilla spoke while pushing her food around with her spoon. You're right about what you said, I think. While it's true that the price of food and necessities will go down as a result of undead labor, it also means that the laborers in basic industries that have been replaced are not earning any incomes whatsoever. The costs of all the unproductive tenants will need to be shouldered by the nobility, and I'm not sure how many nobles would be willing to sustain that arrangement for long. It's not as simple as having your tenants work other jobs. Almost everything that I could think of that the undead are not suited to requires skilled labor, and apprenticeships take many years before one can qualify to become a journeyman. She looked over to where the 4 skeleton crewmen were standing in the hall. The undead showed no signs of impatience or restlessness as time had passed. They simply waited without noise or movement. Take your direction of these skeletons, for instance, she continued, speaking her thoughts aloud as they came to her. If a single maid can direct 4 undead to function as junior staff performing basic duties, such as cleaning or hauling water and the like, then even a manor as large as the guest houses in Erantle might only need 3 or 4 household members to fulfill all those duties. Many vocations will be similarly impacted. Skeletons still need farmers to direct them, so the question then becomes how many can each farmer supervise properly? I'm not sure as to what the extent of their capabilities lie. However, I think that is something you should explore while you have the crew available at your disposal, and I will need to investigate the impact on every industry to come up with a real plan for developing the domain. If that is your wish, my lady, Amelia nodded. Actually, I'm starting to become curious myself with how easy they've been to direct. In my time training as a maid, I know that different members of the staff do not always get along, and junior staff are not always cooperative or do not work out as you expect them to. The conditions of a junior maid are also not very good, the work is hard and the accommodations are often very poor, so having the undead fill those types of jobs is not something that I actually mind. At the same time, however, it's as you say, the more we employ the undead, the more people will lack for work. It seems like a difficult problem. I do not envy you for having to solve it, my lady. Ludmilla considered her maid's words. In truth, it would not be as much a problem for her as it would be for the nobles with well-developed territories and large populations that needed to be reorganized with the changes. Local economies would be turned on their heads and they would be facing chaos as their tenants were simply outmatched by the undead for the majority of their basic industries. If, for example, a single farmer was capable of directing 4 skeletons, and each skeleton matched the labor provided by a human household, then 3 households would be put out of work. The higher the level of development in a domain, the more pronounced this problem would become, as one could not simply cultivate more land when there was no more land to be had. The process of establishing new industries for all of the freed-up labor would be slow and cumbersome, though having the people become used to the undead would probably be a slow process that would mitigate the problem somewhat. For her undeveloped barony, which had always struggled with manpower, however, the undead were an unprecedented boon. Rather than creating an overwhelming surplus of human labor as it would in the inner territories, the undead created a shortage of human labor in Warden's Vale which should be easily filled due to the problems rising elsewhere. It was an edge she would need to exploit, reinvesting the surplus generated by the fief's exports into developing industries that would retain their value against the turmoil in the markets that was sure to come. Finishing the last of her meal, she rose from her seat and walked over to the hall. "You two, head down and help guard the warehouse," she pointed to the skeletons closest to the door, then turned to the others. "You two stand guard outside the door to the manor. Lutzi will come and pick you up for work tomorrow morning." The skeletons quietly filed out of the manor, shutting the door behind them. "Will there be anything else for tonight, my lady?" Amelia asked from the counter where she was putting the used dishes aside to be washed. "No, I'd like to get started early tomorrow," Ludmilla replied while letting her hair down. "Don't let me sleep in, there will be a lot of work ahead." "Yes, my lady. Good night." As scheduled, the undead laborers arrived during the night, and she saw them neatly formed up on the flats outside the entrance of the village when she peeked through the curtains of the hall window. Coming down after a quick breakfast, she spotted the figures of Nonna and Jeeves as well. The undead had assumed much the same formation as they did when they presented themselves for inspection in Iranfell, and it was because of this she immediately noticed that something was wrong. "There's one missing," Ludmilla noted as she double-checked the formations arrayed before her. "What happened?" "It lost its footing on its way down into the valley," Nonna answered. "It did not survive. The equipment has been retrieved." Ludmilla frowned at the unexpected news. The makeshift trail up the gulch that connected to the forest road in the south was usually only frequented by rangers on patrol and not well maintained. It was something she should have warned them about, especially considering that she had just traveled through there a day previous to their dispatch. "They await your orders," the elder lich prompted. Nonna did not even appear to show a sliver of sorrow for the missing skeleton. It had even gone on to mention that its valuables had been recovered rather than dwell on the loss. Ludmilla wasn't sure what to think about its reaction. Did it simply consider it an expendable servitor not even worth such consideration, or would the undead servants of the Sorceress Kingdom treat all of the citizens this way? She wondered what would happen if a human was injured or killed while working. Would these undead simply continue about their tasks with little regard to the events around them? The idea that she somehow gave more thought to her missing laborer than one of its fellow undead was not something that sat well with her, but there was currently nothing to be done about it. "Let's go, then," Ludmilla said. Rather than taking the main road, which led around the base of the hill, she cut across the slope to save time. It was still early in the morning, with the sun not even shining on the upper slopes of the valley to the west yet, but the trek to the old hamlet that had been built to tend to the fields was over an hour away. Their route rejoined the main road where a fork split off to the west, leading up to the lower slopes of the valley. Near the foot of the slope, there was an old wooden bridge that stretched across the churning floodwaters flowing into the marshy flats to the north. Everything about their journey traced through some of the older parts of the fief. The old wooden bridge led to the old road which passed through the old fields with its old hamlet before winding its way up to the top of the valley where the old suspension bridge had frayed and broken in generations past. It was the original way that people traveled to and from the territory, with the road leading south through the forest and into the neighboring barony. There was not much left of the road, though. The sparse traffic that it still saw from the villagers headed out to forage in the woods was not enough to keep it from fading away and becoming overgrown, eventually vanishing into the forests a couple of kilometers beyond the hamlet. Ludmilla tested the bridge as she crossed it, shifting her weight about to see if she could find any weak or rotted sections of planking. The poorly maintained infrastructure of the barony had already claimed one undead laborer. The last thing she needed was one of the Death Knights carrying the heavy iron plows falling into the waters below. She stood to the side after crossing the bridge to watch while the column of skeletons continued up the traces of the road. The first Death Knight approached the far side of the bridge, carrying the plow which must have weighed half a ton directly overhead. It stopped, seeming to sense her trepidation over its crossing, and carried the farm equipment together with another Death Knight, distributing the weight between them. The ominous creaking of the bridge sent tingles of alarm over her, but, in the end, the first plow, then the second made it across without incident. Ludmilla jogged back up to the head of the column, and they continued up the gentle slope into the terraced farmlands, where the road turned to lead them northwest. As of the previous year, the barony only cultivated a small part of the total farmlands leading up to the old hamlet, producing grain which served to supplement the other sources of food hunted and foraged from the wild. The rest of the thousands of acres had lain fallow since before she was born, and where there were once neatly kept fields on the wide terraces along the lower slopes of the valley, now were wild meadows filled with bushes and tall grass. There were dozens of young groves of trees sprouting everywhere she looked, and the edges of the windbreaks that separated the fields into orderly sections were encroaching into the open spaces as well. The small farming hamlet was in better condition than the overgrown fields, some of its buildings seeing seasonal use by the villagers during the farming seasons. Unlike the homes in the village, the ones in the hamlet were of a more regular style of construction one might see anywhere in the duchy, small cottages with timber frames and panels of wattle and daub which served as walls. A well had been dug and constructed out of stone in the center of the village, as well as a large communal barn which was used to store equipment and seed. Releasing the lock and latch, she rolled open the barn doors and looked inside from the entrance. 4 wooden carts were parked before her in the central space of the barn. She instructed several nearby undead to roll them out and moved in to inspect the interior. The walls were lined with wooden bins, which were filled with seed grain, oats and barley as far as was written in the village ledger. The upper floor of the barn stored various old farming tools as well as leftover sacks used to carry grain for transport. There was, thankfully, no sign of damage or vermin having made their way in over the winter. She turned to the entrance, calling for Jeeves. "Use this barn to organize and store the equipment," she instructed him. "We'll keep the carts outside while the fields are being worked. Select 4 skeletons to help you out with everything. The fields nearest to the hamlet will be prepared first, so we can just use this building directly to exchange broken tools and transport seed from, but as we work our way further outwards, we'll be using the carts to transport what is needed between locations." Jeeves bobbed his head in acknowledgement, and 4 skeletons immediately joined him as he walked in, carrying his box. The entire column lined up to drop off the various tools they had been carrying into separate piles. Nonna watched all the activity quietly, writing in the book it carried on its person everywhere it went. Ludmilla walked back out of the barn, leaving Jeeves to his work. On the road which led through the center of the hamlet, the skeletons which had dropped off their equipment formed up again behind the boar-type undead beasts and bone vultures, which had not carried anything from the city. Seeing the sun beginning to peak above the eastern ridge, she motioned for the undead, including the Death Knights carrying their plows, to follow her to the nearest field. She looked over the blanket of stubble left over from the harvest. Green shoots of grass and clumps of weeds had already started to grow despite the cold weather. Ludmilla directed the first plow to be set up. Each was supposed to be operated by a pair of Death Knights, with one replacing the team of draft animals which normally pulled it and the other driving from behind. Since the crew for the Nar which had been provided did not initially know how to sail the vessel, she had been wondering whether these undead laborers would know what they were doing. Apparently not. She watched from the side as the pair of Death Knights tried to puzzle out the operation of the farm equipment. A short while later the other team had set down their own equipment and joined them. They did not audibly communicate with one another, but would often take turns gesturing to one another and performing actions in the air as they discussed amongst themselves. It vaguely looked like a group of middle-aged men that had gathered around a problem, debating over how to address it. Ludmilla only knew that it should have been hitched to whatever was pulling it, then the blades of the plough would cut furrows into the field and turn the soil. After several vague suggestions from her and a series of actions that seemed far too complicated for simple farming equipment, the team looked ready to go. The 2 other Death Knights withdrew to stand beside her, watching with their arms crossed as the first team started to move experimentally. The blades of the gang plough bit deeply into the soil, turning it as the pair slowly drove in a straight line along the edge of the field. Seeing results from their effort, they started walking faster. The walk turned into a jog, then into a run until lines of sod were being thrown up into their wake. As they continued their blistering pace, loud clanking sounds could be heard all the way from where Ludmilla was keeping pace alongside them from the road. It wasn't until a rock the size of her head flew up and landed with a thud near her feet that she realized what the noise was. "Whoa!" she shouted while waving her arms wildly. "Wait! Stop!" It was too late. With an awful noise somewhere between a clang and a thunk, the plow finally hit something it couldn't toss aside. The Death Knight driving the plow was lifted over a meter off the ground as it held onto the handlebars before the entire thing dropped back down again. The one pulling the chains hitched to the equipment ended up with its face in the dirt. Ludmilla ran down to them as they recovered themselves. While the legendary undead were unharmed, the same could not be said for the decidedly not-so-legendary farming equipment. One of the chains used to pull the plow had snapped somewhere and, when they turned the equipment on its side so she could examine it, the full extent of the damage was revealed. The leading edge of the gang plow had been thoroughly mangled, the foreshare had broken off and the head of the main share bent at a right angle. The moldboards were dented and scored from all the large rocks they turned aside at the high speed the Death Knights had been running at. The culprit that finally ended their run was a boulder that was buried just under the surface of the field. She could see the chip where the impact had occurred but, besides that, the boulder seemed smugly intact. She turned to one of the Death Knights. "Head back and get replacement parts from Jeeves," she ordered, "and get the other laborers out here while you're there. Have the skeletons bring their spears and a dozen shovels as well." Ludmilla walked around until she found a stone that would fill the palm of her hand. Picking it up, she returned to the road and waited. When the undead laborers had gathered, she held the stone out in front of her. "Sweep this field," she instructed. "Bring any stones you find of this size and larger to the side of the road. Any other debris as well. Use your spears to probe the ground in case there are boulders lurking under the soil and mark where they are. Those with shovels, dig up this boulder." The skeletons formed two wide lines, one following the other as they slowly picked their way across a stretch of the field while the undead boars rooted ahead of the skeletons, overturning suspicious sections of soil that they came across. The rocks uncovered by the undead were left exposed on the ground, where a bone vulture would fly down and snatch it up to be delivered to the nearby roadside. The laborers equipped with shovels were busily digging around the boulder while the Death Knights were once again standing around the gang plow puzzling out how to replace the broken pieces. The base of the foreshare was easily detached, but they had to unbend the plowshare to work it off the moldboard. One turned around with each of the pieces in one hand, holding them up as if asking Ludmilla what to do with them. "Pass them to a bone vulture," she said. Ludmilla waved one of the flying undead down to pick up the damaged pieces of equipment. She walked over to pick up the broken-off part of the foreshare which had been set aside near where the skeletons were trying to dig up the boulder and tossed it over to the bone vulture waiting nearby. "Take those pieces to Jeeves, maybe he can repair them somehow." With two pieces of the broken blade each talon and one in its beak, the bone vulture flew off in the direction of the barn. Though Ludmilla was somewhat doubtful over her own statement, Jeeves had needed tools to mend the torn cloth and the hamlet did not have a smithy. It was at least worth trying. Turning back to the work on the boulder, she saw that the skeletons had dug a half-meter deep trench around it but, as they went deeper, it only seemed to grow wider. About a meter down and 10 minutes later, a clunking sound could be heard coming out of the hole as a few of the skeletons were met with rocky resistance. She instructed the skeletons to give the rock an experimental push from one side and it appeared to be solidly attached to the stone below. Apparently what she had thought was a boulder was actually a protrusion of bedrock. Ludmilla put her hands on her hips and let out a sigh, wondering what to do. She turned to the sound of the Death Knights approaching. It seemed that between them they had finished replacing the broken parts of the plow and the first team was ready to go again. Looking at the others walking up to see what was going on with the boulder, a reckless thought came to her mind. Motioning for the skeletons to leave the trench, she addressed the group of Death Knights. "Are you able to break off the top of that boulder and carry it over to the road?" It sounded ridiculous even as she said it and stepped out of the way, but the Death Knights did not hesitate at all. The first Death Knight stepped forward and drove the soul of a dark sabaton into the side of the offending boulder. The first strike had no discernible effect, but that was no deterrent. It kicked again and again, with chips of stone coming off the surface until finally a long crack appeared. Several more kicks were delivered for good measure, then the Death Knights dropped into the trench to detach it from the base to carry it off the field. It had split off diagonally, so Ludmilla ordered the jagged end to be broken off and carried away as well. The two broken stones together must have weighed as much as the plow if not more. Filling the hole took several rounds of delivering soil, packing the dirt and adding more soil before it seemed solid enough to stay roughly level with the rest of the field. Nearly an hour had passed since the incident, and Ludmilla felt that her initial expectations of how well the planting season would go were already off the mark. Looking down the field in the direction of the skeletal laborers, she spotted where several shields had been propped up on the soil to mark where their probing had apparently struck more stones underground. Dividing the shovel-wielding skeletons into 2 teams, she had a pair of Death Knights per team follow them out to repeat the process of removing whatever obstacles lay beneath the soil, leaving the plows where they were until all the hazards were cleared from the field. "We've just started and there are already major delays," Ludmilla sighed. She scanned the field one last time. "Let's get back to the hamlet," she said to the remaining Death Knight.